He thought inviting her to the board would be a harmless joke, but in less than 10 minutes, the entire room would forget how to breathe. The chandelier lights cast a soft golden glow over the polished marble floors of the Langston Chess Club, a place where silence usually meant respect, not anticipation of humiliation. Yet tonight, that silence carried a different weight, one laced with quiet judgment and barely concealed amusement as members in tailored suits and elegant dresses gathered around the central table, their murmurs weaving through the air like a low current, all eyes slowly turning toward the woman who had just stepped inside. Olivia Hayes moved with calm, unhurried steps, her simple navy cardigan and modest flats standing in stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. She carried no designer bag, no visible markers of status, only a quiet composure that seemed almost out of place in a room built on reputation and prestige. A few members exchanged glances, subtle smirks forming as they assessed her, not with curiosity, but with quiet dismissal. She paused briefly near the edge of the room, her eyes scanning the rows of chessboards, the polished wood reflecting the overhead light, her expression unreadable, as if she were measuring something deeper than what anyone else could see. Near the center table stood Victor Langston, the club's reigning champion, a man whose name carried weight far beyond these walls. His silver cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted his jacket, his posture relaxed but commanding. He had already noticed her. Of course he had. Men like Victor always noticed disruptions to their carefully controlled environment. His lips curved into a faint smile, not of welcome, but of opportunity. He leaned slightly toward the group gathered beside him, his voice low but intentional. "Looks like we have a new visitor." A few quiet chuckles followed, one member whispering just loud enough to be heard. "She's definitely in the wrong place," another added. "Maybe she's here for the cafe next door." The laughter remained polite, restrained, but the message was clear. Olivia did not belong. She stepped closer now, her footsteps soft, against the marble, stopping just a few feet from the main board where Victor stood. Their eyes met for the first time, his gaze sharp, assessing, her steady, almost indifferent. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something Victor could not quite place, but he dismissed it just as quickly. Confidence had a way of silencing doubt before it could take root. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone smooth but edged with condescension. Olivia's voice, when she answered, was calm, almost gentle. "I was hoping to watch a game." Another ripple of amusement moved through the crowd. Victor tilted his head slightly, considering her, then gestured toward the board with a casual flick of his hand. "Watching is easy," he said, pausing just long enough to let the next words land. "Playing, not so much." A few more chuckles, a subtle tightening of the circle around them as the audience leaned in. Sensing entertainment, Olivia didn't react, not outwardly. Her hands remained loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed, as if none of it touched her. And that, more than anything, made Victor's smile sharpen. There was something about people who didn't respond the way they were expected to that made him curious. And curiosity, for him, often turned into a performance. "Tell you what," he continued, his voice rising just enough to capture the room's full attention. "Why don't we make this interesting?" The room quieted, anticipation building like a held breath. "Why don't you sit down?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "And play around with me." The words hung in the air, not as an invitation, but as a setup, a carefully constructed stage where the outcome had already been decided in the minds of everyone watching. A few members exchanged knowing looks. Someone raised a phone, ready to capture what they assumed would be a brief and entertaining mismatch. Olivia glanced at the chair, then back at Victor, her expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in her eyes now, something deeper, something that didn't quite match the role they had assigned to her. The kind of stillness that comes not from hesitation, but from control. Victor noticed it, just for a second, a flicker of something unfamiliar crossing his face before he masked it with a confident grin. "Don't worry," he added lightly. "I'll go easy on you." More laughter, softer this time, almost sympathetic, as if they were already witnessing the beginning of an inevitable outcome. Olivia stepped forward, her hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair before she pulled it out and sat down. The sound of wood against marble echoing slightly in the otherwise hushed room. She placed her hands gently on the table, her gaze lowering briefly to the board. The pieces arranged in perfect symmetry, black and white, order and strategy, a battlefield disguised as a game. And for the first time, the room felt different, the air shifting in a way no one could quite explain. Victor took his seat across from her, adjusting the pieces with practiced precision, his movements confident, almost casual. But his eyes flicked toward her again, searching for something he couldn't yet define. Around them, the circle tightened, the murmurs faded, and a quiet, expectant silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that comes just before something changes, and though no one there realized it yet. The moment Olivia Hayes placed her hand near her first piece, the outcome they had all been so certain of had already begun to unravel. Victor made the first move with practiced ease, his fingers barely hesitating as he advanced a central pawn 2 squares forward, a classic opening that carried both confidence and control, the kind of move that signaled dominance without saying a word. A few members in the crowd nodded subtly. Recognizing the familiar pattern, someone whispered, "This will be quick," their voice low but certain. Olivia watched the board quietly, her gaze steady, not on Victor, not on the crowd, but on the arrangement of pieces, as if the room around her had already faded into something distant and irrelevant. Her fingers rested lightly near her own pieces, unmoving for a moment longer than expected, just enough for a few people to exchange glances, mistaking her stillness for hesitation. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting casually on the table, his expression relaxed, almost amused. "Take your time," he said, his tone carrying a hint of indulgence, the kind reserved for someone he believed was out of their depth. Olivia did not respond. Instead, she reached forward and moved her knight, not hurriedly, not tentatively, but with a smooth, deliberate motion that ended with a soft click against the polished wood, the sound barely audible. Yet it seemed to echo in the quiet room. A small ripple passed through the onlookers, not because the move was flashy, but because it was precise, unexpectedly precise. Victor's eyes flicked down to the board, just for a second longer than before, then back up, his smile unchanged. But something behind it shifted, something subtle, almost imperceptible. He made his second move quickly, pushing another pawn, building his structure, maintaining the rhythm he had controlled countless times before. Olivia responded just as calmly, her next move coming without delay, her bishop sliding into position, creating a line that intersected with the center in a way that caused one of the older members at the edge of the circle to straighten slightly. His brows knitting together, he did not say anything, but his attention sharpened. Victor noticed the movement in the corner of his eye, but dismissed it, focusing instead on the board. His third move came with the same confidence. But now there was a trace of calculation that had not been there before, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a fraction more focus. Olivia mirrored him, not in style, but in composure, each of her moves landing with the same quiet certainty, no wasted motion, no visible doubt. The pieces began to form patterns that were not immediately obvious to the casual observer, but to those who understood the game, something unusual was taking shape. The murmurs in the room faded further, replaced by a heavier silence, one that carried curiosity instead of amusement. A man near the back lowered his phone slightly, his recording forgotten for a moment. As he leaned forward, Victor shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture, his fingers hovering over a piece before selecting it, then pausing, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed by most. But it was there. Olivia's gaze never left the board, her breathing even, her presence steady, as if she had already seen something the rest of the room had not yet caught up to. When she made her next move, it was faster than the others, a subtle acceleration that caused Victor's eyes to sharpen. The knight he had previously dismissed now anchored a position that began to restrict his options in ways he had not anticipated. He leaned forward slightly, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by a more focused intensity, the kind that appeared when a game required real attention, the kind he had not expected to need tonight. Around them, the circle tightened further. No one spoke now, the earlier smirks replaced by quiet observation. A woman near the front crossed her arms slowly, her expression shifting from amusement to something closer to interest. Victor reached for his next move, his fingers brushing against a pawn before pulling back, then selecting a different piece, a small adjustment, but one that signaled something had changed. Olivia noticed, of course she did. But her expression remained unchanged, calm, almost detached, as if the outcome unfolding on the board was something she had already accepted long before the first piece had been moved. When she responded, it was immediate, her piece sliding into place with that same soft, deliberate sound, and this time, Victor did not lean back. He stayed forward, his eyes fixed on the board, the faintest crease forming between his brows. The room held its breath, not because they fully understood what was happening, but because they could feel it, something subtle, something undeniable. The balance of the game, once assumed to be obvious, was no longer so clear, and for the first time since Olivia had taken her seat, Victor Langston did not look like a man performing for an audience. He looked like a man trying to understand what he was up against. Victor exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound barely audible, yet somehow heavy in the thickening silence, his fingers hovering above the board, as if the right move might reveal itself if he simply waited long enough. But it did. Not immediately, not the way it always had before. The patterns he relied on, the familiar sequences that had carried him through countless victories, felt just slightly out of reach, like something remembered but not fully grasped, across from him. Olivia remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly near the edge of the table, her eyes steady on the board. She did not rush him, did not shift, did not offer even the smallest reaction to the growing tension that now pulsed quietly through the room. Victor finally moved, sliding his bishop along a diagonal line, a controlled attempt to regain space, to reassert the structure of the game. The piece landed with a sharper sound than intended, a subtle crack against the polished surface that drew a few glances from the surrounding crowd. Olivia's gaze followed the movement for only a fraction of a second before she responded, her rook shifting into position with a calm precision that immediately altered the dynamic of the board. One of the observers near the front inhaled quietly, the sound quickly swallowed by the silence. Victor leaned closer now, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his earlier confidence replaced by a focused intensity that bordered on disbelief. He studied the configuration, tracing lines in his mind, calculating, recalculating, searching for the advantage that had always been there for him, always within reach. But something was different. The pathways felt narrower, the options fewer. Olivia's pieces, once dismissed as scattered and uncoordinated, now formed a quiet network of control, subtle but undeniable. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, a small shift that did not go unnoticed by those who knew him well. He had never been a man easily unsettled. Yet there it was, faint but real. He reached for a pawn, paused, then withdrew his hand, selecting instead his knight, repositioning it with careful deliberation, a defensive move, the kind he rarely needed this early in a game. A murmur almost surfaced from the back of the room, but died before it could fully form, the weight of the moment pressing it down. Olivia responded without hesitation, her queen moving into a line that intersected multiple threats at once, not aggressive in appearance, but deeply strategic, the kind of move that did not announce itself loudly, but reshaped everything beneath the surface. Victor froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he traced the implications. 1, 2, 3 moves ahead. Then further, his breathing slowed, his focus sharpening. The room seemed to fade around him now. The audience no longer a factor, only the board, only the game. Yet even in that narrowed world, the unfamiliar tension remained, because the position he faced was not one he recognized from experience. It was something else, something constructed with intention he had not anticipated. Olivia sat quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was a presence about her now, something that filled the space without demanding attention, the kind of presence that comes from certainty, not arrogance. Victor made his next move more quickly than before, a slight push forward, attempting to break the pattern, to force an opening. But Olivia met it instantly, her piece sliding into place with that same soft, controlled sound. And this time, the effect was immediate. One of Victor's central pieces became restricted, its mobility reduced in a way that forced him to reconsider multiple lines at once. A faint crease deepened between his brows, He leaned back for the first time since the game had truly begun, his eyes never leaving the board, as if stepping away might somehow reveal what he was missing around them. The silence had transformed completely, no longer filled with anticipation of entertainment, but with something heavier, something closer to realization. The people who had come expecting a spectacle now found themselves witnessing something they could not easily explain, a shift not just in the game, but in the balance of understanding. Victor leaned forward again, slower this time, his movements more deliberate, his confidence no longer assumed, but tested with each decision. Olivia's hand rested near her pieces, still, patient, waiting, not with anxiety, but with quiet control, and in that moment, it became clear to those paying attention that this was no longer a simple exhibition, no longer a casual challenge meant to amuse. It was something else entirely, something that had turned, quietly and without announcement, into a test Victor Langston had not prepared for, and for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer certain he would win. Victor's fingers hovered above the board again, but this time the hesitation was no longer subtle. It stretched just long enough for the shift to become undeniable, the kind of pause that did not belong to a man in control, the kind that belonged to someone recalculating everything they thought they understood. His eyes moved rapidly across the pieces, tracing lines, testing possibilities, but each path seemed to narrow before it could fully open, as if the board itself had quietly turned against him. Across from him, Olivia remained composed, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, her presence steady in a way that seemed to anchor the entire moment. She did not rush him, did not glance at the crowd, did not react to the growing tension that now filled the room like a silent current. Victor finally committed to a move, advancing his queen with careful intention, an attempt to create pressure, to reclaim initiative. But the movement lacked the earlier confidence it carried. Weight, uncertainty wrapped in precision. The piece touched down with a soft but deliberate sound, and for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The room seemed to hold itself still. Olivia's eyes followed the new position for only a heartbeat before her hand moved, her bishop sliding diagonally into place, intersecting the line of Victor's queen in a way that immediately forced a reconsideration. It was not aggressive, not flashy, but it was exact, the kind of move that quietly dismantled assumptions without announcing itself. A man near the edge of the circle shifted his stance, his arms uncrossing as he leaned forward slightly, his earlier skepticism replaced by focused attention. Victor's gaze sharpened, locking onto the board with an intensity that had fully replaced his earlier amusement. His jaw set, his posture leaning in, closer now, as if proximity might reveal what distance had hidden. He reached for his knight, paused, then redirected to a pawn, pushing it forward in a controlled but defensive adjustment. A small concession, but a concession nonetheless. Olivia responded immediately, her rook gliding into position with that same calm precision, reinforcing a structure that now felt less like a collection of pieces and more like a system closing in. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound faint but heavy, his mind racing ahead, searching for an opening, a break, something that would restore the balance he had lost without realizing it. But the more he calculated, the clearer it became that the balance had not just shifted, it had been reshaped entirely. The options he relied on were no longer available. The space he once controlled now restricted by lines he had not seen forming around them. The silence deepened, no longer filled with curiosity, but with something closer to realization. The audience was no longer watching for entertainment. They were witnessing something they did not fully understand, but could not look away from. A woman near the front slowly lowered her hand from her chin, her expression tightening as she followed the board more carefully. The earlier smiles completely gone. Victor made his next move more quickly, a slight push meant to disrupt Olivia's structure, to force a reaction. But Olivia met it instantly, her queen shifting into a position that created multiple layers of pressure at once, subtle, controlled, unavoidable. Victor froze, his hand still hovering above the board as he traced the implications. One move ahead, then two, then three, and with each calculation, the same conclusion began to surface, not fully formed, but impossible to ignore. He was not dictating this game. He was responding to it, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything spoken aloud. His shoulders straightened slightly, not in confidence, but in focus, the kind that comes when the stakes are no longer assumed, but understood. Olivia's gaze remained steady, her presence unchanged, as if this moment, this shift, had always been part of something she had already seen unfold. The board between them no longer looked symmetrical, no longer balanced. It carried tension in every line, every piece holding a purpose that extended beyond its position. Victor leaned back for a brief second, then forward again, his attention fully consumed, the room around him fading into silence. And in that silence, something became unmistakably clear. The game had moved beyond expectation, beyond assumption, into something far more precise, far more controlled. And for the first time since he had issued the challenge, Victor Langston was not thinking about how to win. He was thinking about how not to lose. Victor stared at the board, his mind moving faster than his hands, yet somehow still a step behind. The patterns he once controlled now shifting under a logic he had not anticipated. Every move he considered seemed to lead not to advantage, but to survival, a subtle but undeniable difference that settled heavily in his chest. His fingers hovered over his queen, then withdrew, moved toward a rook, paused again. The hesitation no longer something he could hide, not from the room, not from himself. Across from him, Olivia remained still, her presence almost quiet enough to disappear, yet impossible to ignore, her eyes steady, not watching him, but watching the board as if it were speaking a language only she fully understood. Victor finally committed, sliding his rook forward in an attempt to create space, to disrupt the tightening structure that had begun to feel suffocating. The piece landed with more force than intended, the sound echoing slightly in the silence, a small crack in the composed image he had maintained for so long. Olivia responded instantly, her knight moving with fluid precision, not dramatic, not aggressive, but perfectly timed. And in that single motion, the pressure increased, not visibly, not to the untrained eye, but to those who understood. It was unmistakable. One of the older members near the back slowly shook his head, almost imperceptibly, as if witnessing something he had not expected to see unfold tonight. Victor leaned forward further, his posture now fully engaged, his earlier ease completely gone. His eyes narrowed, scanning, recalculating, searching for an escape from a position that had quietly closed around him. He moved a pawn, a small adjustment, an attempt to create breathing room. But even as he released the piece, there was a sense that it was not enough, that it would not be enough. Olivia's response came without delay, her queen sliding into a position that aligned multiple threats at once, subtle lines intersecting in ways that forced Victor to consider not one danger, but several, layered and precise. His hand froze mid-air as he traced the board again. One move, two moves, three moves ahead, and with each calculation, the same realization began to sharpen. The structure he faced was not accidental. It was intentional, carefully built, patiently revealed. The room felt smaller now, the circle tighter. No one spoke, no one moved. The earlier amusement replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls themselves. A man who had been recording lowered his phone completely, his attention fully captured. Victor shifted in his seat, a subtle movement, but one that carried weight. His shoulders no longer relaxed, his breathing measured, controlled, but heavier than before. He reached for his bishop, moved it slightly, then stopped, pulling back, choosing instead a defensive repositioning of his king, a move that confirmed what many in the room had already begun to suspect. He was no longer dictating the game. He was protecting himself from it. Olivia's eyes flicked briefly to his king, then back. Across the board, her next move coming with the same calm certainty, her rook sliding into alignment with her queen, forming a connection that tightened the position even further. Victor's eyes widened just slightly, the smallest crack in his composure, but enough for those watching closely to see that something fundamental had shifted. He leaned back for a brief second, exhaling quietly, then leaned forward again, his focus absolute, his pride now fully engaged. But even that felt different, less about dominance, more about resistance. The realization settled slowly, but firmly. This was no longer a game he could win through familiarity or confidence. This was something else, something deeper, something that required him to confront not just the board, but the possibility that he had underestimated the person sitting across from him. Olivia remained unchanged, her posture steady, her expression calm, but there was a quiet finality in the way she moved her pieces now, not rushed, not forced, but certain, as if each move was not a reaction, but a continuation of something already decided. Victor studied the board again, longer this time, the silence stretching, the weight building, and then, for the first time since the game began, he did not immediately reach for a piece. He simply stared, because in front of him, clear and unavoidable, was the shape of a position he could not easily escape, and in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. He was not facing a casual opponent. He was facing someone who had been in control from the very first move, and now, the cost of his assumption was unfolding one quiet decision at a time. Victor did not move right away, and that hesitation stretched longer than any moment before it, long enough for the silence in the room to become almost tangible, pressing against every person standing there. His eyes locked onto the board, as if the answer might reveal itself through sheer focus. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became that there was no simple solution waiting for him. Only consequences unfolding from choices already made. His fingers finally lowered, selecting his queen, and with careful control he repositioned it, not to attack, but to guard, a defensive alignment that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier, a subtle shift that did not need explanation. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. Olivia's gaze followed the move without emotion, her expression unchanged, but there was something final in the stillness that surrounded her, as if the direction of the game had already been decided, and she was simply allowing it to reach its conclusion at its own pace. She moved next, her bishop gliding into position with quiet certainty. And in that single motion, the pressure on Victor's position intensified again, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with precision, each line now working together, each piece contributing to something larger than itself. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, then leaned forward again, closer this time, his focus absolute, his earlier confidence completely replaced by calculation and something else beneath it, something unfamiliar. He traced the board again, one move ahead, then two, then further, but every variation led to the same place. A narrowing path, a tightening structure, no clear escape. The room remained silent. No whispers now, no shifting feet. Even the subtle sounds of movement had disappeared, as if the entire space had agreed to witness this moment without interruption. A man near the back slowly removed his glasses, wiping them absently. Though his eyes never left the board, Victor reached for a pawn, paused, then withdrew, his hand hovering in midair for a second longer than it should have, before finally selecting his rook, moving it into a position that created a temporary defense, a small barrier against what was coming. But even as he completed the move, there was a sense that he already knew it would not hold. Olivia responded immediately, her queen sliding into alignment with her rook, the connection now unmistakable, the structure complete, the pressure undeniable. Victor's eyes widened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to reveal that he saw it now, truly saw it. Not just the current position, but what it would become. 2 moves ahead, 3 moves ahead. A sequence unfolding that he could not stop without sacrificing something essential. His posture stiffened, his hand lowering slowly to the edge of the table, no longer hovering, no longer searching, simply resting there as he absorbed the reality in front of him, around them. The room felt frozen, every person watching now fully aware that this was no longer a question of if, but when. Olivia remained composed, her hands resting lightly, her presence steady, not pressing, not rushing, simply allowing the moment to exist. Victor finally moved again, a controlled adjustment of his king, a necessary step, but one that confirmed the position further. Olivia did not hesitate, her rook sliding forward with that same soft, deliberate sound, and in that instant, the shape of the game became undeniable, not to everyone, not yet, but to those who understood. It was clear. Victor froze completely, his eyes locked onto the board, his breathing slower now, heavier, as he traced the final lines, and there it was, unavoidable, precise, complete, a sequence that would lead to only one outcome, no matter how he responded. He leaned back slowly, his hand moving away from the table, his gaze lifting for the first time in what felt like minutes, meeting Olivia's eyes across the board. And in that look, something shifted, not defeat fully spoken, but recognition, quiet and undeniable, the kind that did not need words. The room remained silent, waiting, but the truth had already settled into the space between them, and for the first time since the game began, Victor Langston understood exactly what he had walked into. Victor did not look back at the board right away, not because he did not understand it, but because he understood it too well. The sequence was no longer hidden in calculation. It had revealed itself with a clarity that left no room for illusion. His shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that the game had already moved beyond his control. The room remained still, every eye fixed on him, waiting for a reaction, for resistance, for something that might delay what was now inevitable. But Victor did not rush. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his gaze returning to the board with a calm that had replaced the earlier tension. His hand lifted, hovering briefly above his king, then shifting away, tracing the final possibilities one last time, not searching for escape, but confirming what he already knew. Across from him, Olivia remained exactly as she had been, composed, steady, her hands resting lightly, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome unfolding between them had never been in question. Victor finally made his move, a small adjustment, precise, controlled, but ultimately symbolic, a move that delayed nothing, changed nothing, only acknowledged the path forward. The piece settled into place with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The room did not react, no one moved, because everyone felt it. The shift, the final step before the end. Olivia's hand moved almost immediately, her queen gliding across the board with quiet certainty, the motion smooth, deliberate, final. The piece came to rest, and in that single moment, everything became clear, not just to Victor, but to everyone watching. The lines converged, the structure complete, the outcome unavoidable. Victor froze, his eyes fixed on the board, tracing the position one last time, though there was nothing left to trace, no alternative, no escape, just the quiet precision of a game that had been decided long before this final move. A breath moved through the room, not a sound, but a collective shift, the kind that happens when understanding arrives all at once. Victor leaned back slowly, his hand lowering to the table, his gaze lifting from the board to Olivia, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because nothing needed to be said, the silence carried everything, respect, realization, the weight of what had just happened. Victor gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. His voice, when it came, was quiet, steady, stripped of any trace of the earlier arrogance. Well played. The words hung in the air, simple, but heavy with meaning. Olivia met his gaze, her expression calm, not triumphant, not proud, just steady, and then she gave a slight nod in return, her voice soft, but clear enough for those closest to hear. Thank you. There was no celebration, no reaction from her beyond that. No need to emphasize what the board had already made undeniable around them. The room remained silent for a second longer, as if everyone needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Then slowly, almost hesitantly, the atmosphere shifted, not back to what it had been before, but into something quieter, more thoughtful. The earlier smirks gone, replaced by expressions of reflection, of reconsideration. The assumptions that had filled the room at the beginning of the night now felt distant, almost misplaced. Victor glanced once more at the board, then back at Olivia, and this time, there was no doubt in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes when a person is forced to confront something beyond their expectations. He stood, straightening his jacket out of habit, but the gesture carried none of the earlier display. It was simple now, grounded, real. Olivia remained seated for a brief moment longer, her gaze resting on the board, as if closing something quietly. Then she rose as well, her movements as calm as they had been from the beginning. The distance between them unchanged, but the meaning entirely different. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, one truth lingered in the silence they left behind. Some victories are not loud, not celebrated, but felt, deeply and unmistakably, by everyone who witnesses them. The sound returned slowly, not all at once, but in fragments, a chair shifting, a quiet exhale, the faint rustle of fabric as people adjusted their stance. Yet even as the room began to move again, something had changed in a way that could not be undone. The polished walls, the soft lighting, the carefully curated elegance of the club all remained the same, but the atmosphere felt different now, heavier, more aware, as if the space itself had absorbed what had just happened and was still trying to understand it. Olivia stepped back from the table, her hands resting briefly at her sides, her gaze no longer on the board, but somewhere beyond it, not searching for acknowledgement, not waiting for reaction, simply present in the quiet aftermath. Victor stood across from her, his posture straight but no longer imposing, his expression composed, yet stripped of the earlier certainty. He glanced once more at the arrangement of pieces, then back at Olivia, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might say something more, something that would explain or reclaim or soften the shift that had taken place. But he did not, because there was nothing left to explain. The board had already spoken with a clarity that words could not improve. A man near the front cleared his throat softly, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, as if trying to return to something familiar. But the attempt fell flat. No one followed. No one filled the silence with conversation or laughter. The earlier energy of the room, the casual confidence, the quiet superiority, had dissolved into something far more restrained. A woman who had once stood with her arms crossed now lowered them completely, her gaze thoughtful, her expression softened by something close to humility. One of the younger members, who had been among the first to smile at Olivia's arrival, now looked down briefly, as if reconsidering that moment. The assumptions that had felt so natural then now carried a different weight. Victor finally spoke again, his voice measured, not loud, but steady enough to reach those closest. "You play often?" It was not a question, not entirely, more an acknowledgement wrapped in curiosity. Olivia met his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged. "Sometimes," she replied, her tone calm, offering nothing more than the truth and nothing less. Victor gave a slight nod, absorbing the answer, though it clearly left more unsaid than it revealed. He did not press further, perhaps understanding that whatever skill had just unfolded on that board did not come from occasional practice alone, but from something deeper, something that did not need explanation. The distance between them remained unchanged, but the dynamic had shifted entirely. The imbalance that had defined the beginning of the evening no longer existed. In its place stood something quieter, something earned. Olivia turned slightly, her attention drifting toward the edge of the room, as if preparing to leave, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the attention that now followed her. Because there was attention now, not the kind that judges or dismisses, but the kind that observes, that recognizes, that remembers. A few members instinctively stepped aside, creating space without being asked, a subtle gesture, but one that spoke more clearly than any apology. Victor watched her for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful, not with regret alone, but with understanding, the kind that arrives only after certainty has been challenged. And then, almost as if remembering something important, he spoke once more, his voice quieter this time, but carrying across the space with clarity. "You should come back." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. They carried respect now, not performance, not invitation as a test, but as acknowledgement. Olivia paused briefly, just enough to register the words, her hand resting lightly against the strap of her bag. Then she gave a small nod, not committing, not dismissing, simply accepting the moment for what it was. And then she continued walking, her steps as calm and steady as they had been when she first entered. The room watched her go, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet reflection. And as the door closed softly behind her, the space she left behind did not return to what it had been. Because some moments do not end when the people involved walk away. They remain, lingering in the air, reshaping the way everything that follows is understood. And that night, in a room built on reputation and quiet pride, something far more lasting than a single game had taken place, something that did not need to be announced, because everyone who had witnessed it already knew. The door closed behind Olivia with a soft, almost unnoticeable click, yet the sound lingered in the room far longer than it should have, as if marking the end of something none of them had expected to experience that evening. Victor remained standing near the board, his gaze fixed not on the door, but on the pieces still arranged in their final positions. The quiet geometry of the game now carrying a weight that extended beyond strategy, beyond competition. He reached forward slowly, not to reset the board as he usually would, but simply to touch one of the pieces, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of a rook as if grounding himself in something tangible, something certain. But even that felt different now, because certainty had been the very thing challenged and quietly dismantled. Around him, the members of the club began to move again, conversations returning in low, measured tones. But none of them carried the same casual confidence as before. The laughter that had once filled the room was absent, replaced by something more reflective, more careful. A man who had earlier joked near the entrance now spoke quietly to another member, his voice lower, his words chosen with more thought, as if aware that assumptions could no longer be made so easily. A woman near the window glanced once more at the door Olivia had exited through, then back at the board, her expression thoughtful, almost contemplative, as though replaying the game in her mind, not just the moves, but the moment it had all shifted. Victor finally straightened, his hand leaving the piece as he stepped back from the table, his posture composed, but different now, less about presence, more about awareness. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of a few members who quickly looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, the kind that passes silently between people who have witnessed something that changes perspective. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, but the motion carried no trace of performance. It was simple, grounded, almost automatic. One of the younger members approached the table slowly, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "That was," he began, then stopped, unable to find a word that felt accurate. Victor gave a small nod, not finishing the sentence for him, not needing to, because whatever word they might have chosen would not have captured what had truly taken place. It was precise. Victor said quietly after a moment, his voice calm, reflective, not defensive. The younger man nodded, though his expression suggested he was still processing. More than he could articulate, Victor turned his attention back to the board, studying it again, not as a player searching for mistakes, but as someone trying to understand a lesson, something deeper than the game itself. His eyes traced the lines Olivia had created, the subtle connections, the quiet control that had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight, and he realized, not suddenly, but with a steady clarity, that the game had not been about proving skill, it had been about revealing it, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a patience that required no validation. The room continued to shift around him, conversations forming, then fading, but always returning to the same unspoken center, the memory of what had just happened. A few members began to reset other boards, the familiar rhythm of pieces being placed back into starting positions returning in soft, controlled movements. Yet even that routine felt different, as if each person now carried a quiet awareness that the next game, the next opponent, might not be what they assumed. Victor took a slow breath, then reached forward and began to reset his own board, placing each piece carefully, deliberately, restoring the symmetry that defined the beginning of every match. But as he did, his movements carried a new kind of intention, not just preparation, but respect for the game, for the moment, and for the person who had just walked out without needing to say anything more. When the board was finally set, he stepped back, his gaze lingering for a second longer before he turned away. The room behind him continuing its quiet return to normal, but not quite the same, not anymore, because some lessons do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, settle deeply, and remain long after the moment has passed. And that night, in a room that had once measured worth by reputation and appearance, something far more enduring had taken hold, a simple truth, revealed without effort, that respect is not given by assumption, but earned in silence, and remembered long after the game is over.